Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. My name is Nick. So I'm a big Pink Floyd fan, have been for a long time, but today I'm going to be talking about my 5 most underrated Pink Floyd albums. There's a bunch of links down below, make sure you go check them all out. There's links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for our merch page. There's links for the Vinyl Den Spotify and Apple Music playlist that we put together every week, and also the Patreon page. Make sure you go check all that out. Of course, if you enjoy the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below, and make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time we release new episodes. So I've been a pretty big Pink Floyd fan since I was in my teens, I think, when I started listening to Pink Floyd. And, I think I kind of started with, like, The Wall and Dark Side of the Moon were, like, the big albums. I remember one of my friends loved the movie The Wall, so I've watched The Wall probably, a few dozen times before I graduated high school. But, that was kind of where I kind of left my fanhood when it came to Pink Floyd. And it's probably within the last probably 8 to 10 years that I started digging more and more into their discography. And, I'm a huge fan. I love all their albums. They're definitely one of my favorite bands. And actually, if you want to know more about Pink Floyd, I actually did an episode of the Life in General podcast a few years back. I'll put a link below down in the description where we kind of broke down the band, all their albums, a lot of the inner fighting between the band members and things like that. It actually ended up being a pretty good episode. You can go check that out if you want to. But today I'm going to be talking about 5 albums that I think are criminally underrated from the band. For the first one, I'm going to go all the way back to June of 1968. And that, of course, is with their second studio album, Saucer Full of Secrets. Their first 2 albums, this one and their debut album, Piper the Gates of Dawn, very heavily psychedelic, very much in that late 60s psychedelic rock kind of genre. But there were kind of some periods in this album where they were kind of transitioning a little bit, bringing in some more straightforward rock kind of elements. They did bring in David Gilmour during the recording of this album, kind of help fill in for Syd Barrett when Syd Barrett couldn't quite do the things he needed to do in the recording studio. I know there was one famous story where they were working on getting a track down. And every single time they'd play it, Syd Barrett would play a completely different way, and the band would have to relearn the track all over again. It was just things like that were kind of getting the band to a boiling point where they just couldn't deal with some of the antics that he was doing. But Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun is the only track in Pink Floyd's catalog with all 5 of the band members on there. So that's on this album. There are a couple other great tracks on here also. Let There Be More Light and Remember a Day are 2 tracks that to this day I still love and still listen to quite often. And it was also during this period that the band were on their way to a gig one night, and one of the band members said, hey, should we even stop and pick up, or do we even bother to pick up Syd? And somebody else was like, nah, don't worry about him. And that was kind of the end of Syd Barrett for Pink Floyd. He didn't perform with the band anymore after that. But it's a great album. If you're not familiar with this early Pink Floyd era, and you want to listen to some of it, I would definitely tell you I would pick this one over Piper the Gates of Dawn. I will say that it's kind of hard to see. This is the 2016 reissue, but if you look here on the edge here, they got Doctor Strange is actually on the cover of this. So it's kind of an interesting thing if you want to kind of go back and look. There's some kind of another Marvel character up here in the corner too. It's a really interesting kind of cover to go back and look at, though. The next album, I think, really kind of ushered in their most creative period. They're obviously their most commercially successful period. And that album is their 6th studio album, Metal. This was released in November of 1971. And Metal is really kind of an interesting album to kind of go back and listen to, because if you listen to Atom Heart Mother, which was released prior to this, that was still a lot more of that kind of psychedelic kind of rock mixed in with some other kind of rock. It was just that was almost like a completely different period for the band. With Metal, Roger Waters really kind of took over the full creative control. I think they really kind of focused their effort on this album. And this is kind of, I've always looked at this album as kind of like the transition from what almost what they were with Syd Barrett. And then after Syd Barrett left the band, after their second studio album, I felt like they kind of wandered around for a couple of albums and really kind of tried to search and find their sound. I think they really found it with Metal. I think it is their most, at least at that time, their most cohesive album, their most complete album. This album is probably mostly known for Echoes, which was the one track that takes up the entire B-side of the album. It's one of my favorite Pink Floyd tracks. But there are some other great ones on here. Fearless is a great track, and then One of These Days is another great track also. So definitely one to kind of go back and listen to. If you're not familiar with this one, if all you know from Pink Floyd is, those big, huge albums from the 70s, I really rank this up there with those top, 4 or 5 albums. The next album is one that I think a lot of people out there, I think, really didn't understand, or kind of in retrospect going back, really don't understand the placement of it and the kind of creative direction of it. But that is an album that was released in June of 1972, Obscured by Clouds. This is their 7th studio album, so this is the one that came out right after Metal. I think the one thing that a lot of people just don't understand about this album is, creatively, yeah, a lot of people look at it as kind of a going back to a little bit earlier sound from the band, but this album was supposed to be something very different. This album was supposed to be a soundtrack to a French film, and then as they were working on it, they had a falling out with the director of the film, so they decided to kind of break off and do their own thing with their album. What's the Deal and Mud Men are 2 of my favorite tracks off this album, and ones that are probably one of my favorite tracks of their first 6 or 7 albums. But it's one that, like I said, it's just, yes, if you go and listen to it, it's very different from what they were doing with Metal, and obviously what there was going to come with Dark Side of the Moon. But the interesting thing about this album is they actually had already started recording for Dark Side of the Moon. They actually started that process during the tour for Metal, and there's actually a couple of bootlegs out there from that Metal tour that you can kind of go back and you can hear some of those early Dark Side of the Moon tracks. So that's definitely kind of an interesting thing to kind of go back and listen to. These songs are definitely a lot shorter, and I think there's a lot more acoustic guitars used in this album than what they've done with their first with their last couple of albums, whether it be Metal or Atom Heart Mother. But just overall, it is a really good album. I think it's really one that a lot of Pink Floyd fans kind of look over and forget about. But it's definitely worth listening to. Another album that I think really gets lost in their collection and probably gets a lot more hate than it really deserves is their 12th studio album, released in March of 1983. Of course, that is The Final Cut. The Final Cut is definitely, it's another one of those interesting kind of albums, because The Final Cut originally was supposed to be the soundtrack for the film adaptation of The Wall. And then with the beginning of the Falklands War, Roger decided to kind of go a different route and do something separate and just use the Wall album as the soundtrack. So the movie might have been very different had they gone down a different path. This is also the last Pink Floyd album to feature Roger Waters. It's also the only album not to include Richard Wright on keyboards. He, of course, had a falling out with the band during the recording of The Wall and was used just as a studio musician on the recording of The Wall. It didn't fully rejoin the band until they recorded the Division Bell. So it was actually a couple more albums after this album that they was fully kind of brought back into the band. This album was definitely like the nail in the coffin for Pink Floyd. There was a lot of infighting between Roger Waters and David Gilmour. Nick Mason didn't have a whole lot to do, recording wise on this album. That's why a lot of people kind of look at The Final Cut as more of a Roger Waters solo album than a Pink Floyd album. But during this recording process, David Gilmour was accusing Roger Waters of writing tracks that just weren't up to par for the band, and Roger Waters was accusing David Gilmour of just kind of mailing in his guitar parts and not taking any active role in the creative process. So there's all that infighting, and it still ended up with a great album. I would say that I would still put this out of their 15 studio albums. I would definitely put The Final Cut in the top half still. It's still a great album to kind of go back and listen to. The concept for this album that Roger Waters kind of crafted was, so if you don't know, Roger Waters' dad died back in World War II. So the concept is kind of the betrayal that Roger felt towards his father is kind of like the basis for the concept of this album. I will say that it was after this album that the band broke up, and Roger Waters famously said that Pink Floyd was a spent force, and then sued the band to try to stop the band from moving forward with the Pink Floyd name. A bunch of great tracks on here, though. Some of my favorites: "When the Tigers Broke Free," "The Fletcher Memorial Home" is a great track. "Southampton Dock," "Two Suns in the Sunset" are all just fantastic albums. Some of the best stuff that the band put out, post The Wall. So it seems like the most hated albums from Pink Floyd fans are either the Final Cut or the next one. This one was released in November of 2014. It is The Endless River. It's their 15th and last studio album. This is definitely it's definitely a different kind of Pink Floyd album. This album was fully, so let me kind of go back a little bit. Richard Wright, who was one of the founding members of the band, he was the keyboardist, almost like the heart of the band, died back in 2008. So in 2014, I guess the final two remaining members of the band, David Gilmour and Nick Mason, went back to through a lot of the tapes that Richard Wright recorded during the recording process for the Division Bell in the early 90s, and used those remaining tapes, those unused tapes, to kind of craft this album, and kind of use this as almost a way to kind of pay homage to Richard Wright for all of his services, that really kind of, like I said, being that kind of heart and soul of the band for as long as he was. This album is definitely different from anything else that Pink Floyd had done before. This was almost entirely an instrumental, almost kind of like ambient music at times. There's only one track, Louder Than Words, which is the very last track on the album, is the only track that has lyrics to it. And I have to admit that that's like the one big knock on this album, is the lyrics for that song are just not good. It's something that Pink Floyd struggled with once Roger Waters left the band, was writing lyrics. A lot of the lyrics, at least for Division Bell and for that one track on the Endless River, I think were all written by David Gilmour's wife. When they wrote and recorded A Momentary Lapse of Reason, David Gilmour brought in outside songwriters to help him write those lyrics. But so like I said, I think the lyrics on that, on Louder Than Words, I think is really the one big drawback. It's a fantastic album to kind of go back and listen to. Like I said, very different from anything else that Pink Floyd had done. Much more down that ambient kind of music line. But I still think it's one that it is worth listening to. Pink Floyd was one of those bands that I don't think ever created a bad album, and I think as far as hatred from Pink Floyd fans go, The Endless River is probably up there at the very top. But like I said, it's an album where they wanted to kind of pay their respects to Richard Wright. This album has a very nostalgic, almost sentimental kind of sound for Pink Floyd, very early, very very early Pink Floyd's kind of sound. Like I said, I think it's a great album. I think it is one of their 5 most underrated albums, and definitely one that's worth checking out and listening to. If you're one of those people that say, the band ended with either the Final Cut, which I completely get, or the band ended with the Division Bell, it's definitely worth kind of go back and checking this one out for sure. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what albums from the Pink Floyd catalog you think are their most underrated. They got 15 of them. I know it's not Dark Side of the Moon or The Wall, Animals, Wish You Were Here, those big 70s albums. But they've got a lot of great stuff on their other albums. So drop me a comment. Let me know what you guys think. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me the old thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. And that's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.